The morning of June 4th, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm over the vast Pacific waters surrounding Midway Atoll. Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the horizon with the weight of an entire theater of war pressing upon his shoulders. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor's devastating surprise attack, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, conquering territory after territory with terrifying efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Joseph John Rochefort hunched over his cryptographic equipment in the basement of the 14th Naval District Intelligence Office in Pearl Harbor, his eyes bloodshot from weeks of relentless code-breaking. The intercepted Japanese communications had revealed something extraordinary: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan to strike Midway Atoll and draw out the remaining American Pacific Fleet for a decisive battle. What the Japanese didn't know was that their naval codes had been partially broken, giving the Americans an unprecedented advantage. Captain Miles Browning paced nervously aboard the USS Enterprise, acutely aware that the 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, represented nearly the entire striking power of the Pacific Fleet. The odds were staggering: 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and over 250 aircraft against America's modest force of 3 carriers and 150 aircraft. The Japanese combined fleet had never been defeated in battle, and their pilots were seasoned veterans of countless Pacific campaigns. The psychological weight of 6 months of continuous defeats pressed heavily upon every American sailor and pilot. Wake Island had fallen after a heroic defense. The Philippines had surrendered after General Douglas MacArthur's retreat to Australia. The Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and countless Pacific islands had fallen like dominoes before the Japanese advance. American newspapers back home painted increasingly grim pictures of Pacific losses, while Japanese propaganda proclaimed the inevitable establishment of their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That as dawn broke over Midway's 2 small islands, radar operators detected the first wave of incoming Japanese aircraft. The battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War was about to begin, though none of the participants could have imagined how completely it would transform the strategic landscape. The American defenders on Midway, a mixture of Marines, sailors, and Army Air Forces personnel, prepared for what many believed might be their final stand. Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, made final preparations for the most crucial naval engagement in American history. His tactical decisions over the next few hours would either vindicate the intelligence breakthrough that had made this ambush possible, or result in the complete destruction of America's Pacific naval capability. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure at Midway would likely force a negotiated peace with Japan, leaving them dominant across the entire Pacific region. The morning air filled with the distant rumble of aircraft engines as both fleets prepared for battle, unaware that this engagement would become the turning point that would echo across every theater of the global war. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of the Soviet Union, the first Japanese strike wave, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, approached Midway Atoll at 0630 hours with 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima Kate bombers, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. The American defenders scrambled every available aircraft, including obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters that were no match for the superior Zeros. But their courage would not be questioned this day. Major Floyd Blue Parks led the Marine Fighter Squadron 221 into the air, knowing his Buffalo fighters were flying coffins against the advanced Japanese aircraft. Of the 25 Marine fighters that rose to meet the attack, only 10 would return. But their sacrifice bought precious time for the American carriers lurking beyond the horizon. The Japanese bombers struck Midway's installations with devastating precision, but the airfield remained operational, a crucial factor that would influence the battle's outcome. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Kiichi Nagamo faced a critical decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. His aircraft had returned from the Midway strike, reporting the need for a second attack on the atoll's defenses. Simultaneously, his scouts reported the presence of American naval forces to the northeast, though the composition of this force remained unclear. Nagamo ordered his second-wave aircraft, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship attacks, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second strike on Midway. This decision would prove catastrophic. As Japanese crews frantically rearmed aircraft on the crowded flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, American torpedo bombers from all three carriers began their attack runs. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, pressed home their attack with obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator aircraft that proved sitting ducks for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. According to historical accounts preserved in the Naval War College archives, Waldron's entire squadron was shot down except for Ensign George Henry Gay, who floated in the water and witnessed the entire battle from his life raft. Their sacrifice was not in vain. The low-altitude torpedo attacks forced Japanese combat air patrol fighters down to sea level, leaving the Japanese carriers vulnerable to the high-altitude dive bomber attacks that followed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, arrived over the Japanese fleet at the most opportune moment possible. The Japanese carriers were caught with their decks full of fuel lines, armed aircraft, and ordnance-floating ammunition dumps waiting for a spark. McCluskey's bombers dove through scattered clouds and began their attacks at precisely 10:22. In the morning, the results were devastating beyond American hopes or Japanese fears. Within 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best's bomb struck Akagi directly, Admiral Nagamo's flagship. The explosions of rearming aircraft and fuel created infernos that would consume these proud ships completely. Only Hiryu remained operational, launching a desperate counterattack that would damage Yorktown, but could not alter the battle's ultimate outcome: the psychological impact of watching 3 fleet carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, transformed into blazing funeral pyres, sent shockwaves through the entire Japanese fleet. Captain Mark Andrew Mitcher watched from Hornet's Bridge as the morning's impossible victory unfolded before his eyes. The 3 burning Japanese carriers, their flight decks twisted metal, their aircraft exploding and cascading secondary detonations, represented more than tactical success. They embodied the first decisive American victory in the Pacific War, a victory that would resonate far beyond these waters. The surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu, under Captain Tomio Kaku's command, launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters in a desperate counterstrike. These aircraft, guided by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, found and attacked USS Yorktown at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. The American carrier, already weakened from damage sustained at the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier, absorbed 3 direct bomb hits that started serious fires and knocked out her boilers. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the American task force from Yorktown's bridge, was forced to transfer his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria as damage control parties fought to save his flagship. The sight of Yorktown listing heavily and smoking sent ripples of concern through the American fleet. Had their victory been too costly? The answer would come with Hiryu's fate. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie led 17 Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown, launched before the Japanese attack in the hunt for the last Japanese carrier. At 5 o'clock in the evening, they found Hiryu racing northwest at maximum speed, her deck spotted with aircraft preparing for another strike. Leslie's bombers dove through intense anti-aircraft fire and scored 4 direct hits that left Hiru, as doomed as her three sister ships. The psychological warfare aspect of these carrier losses cannot be overstated. Japanese naval aviation had trained for years to achieve perfect coordination between carriers, creating an integrated striking force that had dominated every engagement since Pearl Harbor. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day represented the destruction of over half of Japan's trained carrier pilots, irreplaceable veterans whose skills had taken years to develop. Commander Mitsu Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, lay wounded aboard the burning Akagi and witnessed the destruction of Japanese naval supremacy. His later writings, preserved in post-war interviews with American naval historians, described the devastating impact on Japanese morale as they watched their supposedly invincible fleet burning on the horizon of the victory began reaching American forces across the Pacific within hours. General MacArthur's headquarters in Australia received coded transmissions describing the carrier battle's outcome, providing the first genuine cause for celebration since the war began. The timing proved especially crucial as Japanese forces in New Guinea were preparing for their advance on Port Moresby, an operation that would now proceed without the naval air support that had been planned. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, received Nimitz's initial battle report with barely concealed elation. After months of defending America's Pacific strategy against critics who demanded resources be concentrated in Europe, King finally possessed proof that offensive operations in the Pacific could succeed. The implications would echo through every subsequent strategic decision made by the combined chiefs of staff. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4th, both fleets withdrew from the battle area, but the strategic situation had been fundamentally transformed in America's favor. The news of Midway's victory reached Allied commanders worldwide through encrypted diplomatic channels, creating a psychological earthquake that reverberated from the deserts of North Africa to the embattled cities of the Soviet Union. Prime Minister Winston Spencer Churchill received the coded telegram at his underground war rooms beneath London at 3 in the morning on June 5th, and immediately recognized its global significance. Churchill understood that Midway represented far more than a naval victory in the distant Pacific. For 18 months, the Axis powers had appeared unstoppable. German forces were advancing toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields, while Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened the Suez Canal from their positions in Egypt. Japan's Pacific conquests had seemed to validate Axis claims of inevitable victory, but Midway shattered that narrative decisively. Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery, preparing for what would become the Second Battle of El Alamein, received Churchill's personal message describing the Pacific victory while reviewing intelligence reports on German and Italian positions near Alexandria. Montgomery later wrote in his memoirs that Midway's success provided crucial psychological momentum for his own offensive planning, demonstrating that Axis forces could be decisively defeated when properly engaged. According to classified reports, later declassified by the British Ministry of Defense, Churchill immediately ordered propaganda broadcasts emphasizing Midway's significance to resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. The BBC's European service began transmitting coded messages to French, Norwegian, Dutch, and Belgian resistance networks, using Midway as proof that Allied fortunes were finally turning. In Moscow, Marshal Joseph Stalin received news of the Pacific battle while planning defensive operations around Stalingrad. Soviet intelligence services had been closely monitoring Japanese military capabilities, concerned about potential Japanese attacks on Siberian territories, while Soviet forces remained concentrated against Germany. Midway's outcome effectively eliminated Japan's ability to open a second front against the Soviet Union, freeing additional Red Army divisions for the European theater. The psychological impact extended to occupied territories throughout the Pacific. General Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright, imprisoned by Japanese forces after the Philippines surrender, later testified that news of Midway filtered through prisoner-of-war camps within weeks, providing desperate hope to thousands of Allied prisoners who had begun to believe their cause was hopeless. Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, fighting Japanese occupation forces in mainland China with limited Allied support, recognized Midway's strategic implications immediately. Japanese forces in China had been receiving reinforcements and supplies through secure Pacific shipping lanes that were now vulnerable to American naval interdiction. Chiang's forces began planning expanded operations against Japanese supply lines, confident that naval support from across the Pacific would be increasingly available. The Dutch government in exile in London saw Midway as the first step toward eventual liberation of the Dutch East Indies, whose oil resources had been fueling Japanese military expansion. Queen Wilhelmina personally thanked Admiral Nimitz through diplomatic channels, recognizing that Dutch colonial recovery depended entirely upon Japanese naval defeat. Australian Prime Minister John Joseph Curtin, who had been preparing for potential Japanese invasion since Pearl Harbor, finally began shifting resources from purely defensive preparations toward offensive planning. The Royal Australian Navy began coordinating more closely with American Pacific Fleet operations, confident that the strategic initiative had fundamentally shifted. Free French forces under General Charles-André Joseph Marie de Gaulle received news of Midway while planning operations in North Africa, recognizing that global Allied morale improvements would translate into increased support for French liberation efforts. The Battle of Midway's psychological impact transcended military circles, fundamentally altering the global propaganda war that had been dominated by Axis victories since 1939. Office of War Information Director Elmer Holmes Davis recognized immediately that Midway provided the first genuinely decisive Allied victory suitable for major propaganda campaigns. American newspapers, which had been reporting an unbroken string of Pacific defeats since Pearl Harbor, suddenly had a victory worthy of front-page treatment. The New York Times headline on June 7th read, "Japanese suffer heavy losses in Midway battle," while the Chicago Tribune proclaimed, "Navy smashes Japanese fleet." These headlines represented the first genuinely positive war news American civilians had received, creating a surge of homefront morale that translated directly into increased war bond sales and factory production. Hollywood studios immediately began developing film projects based on the Midway victory, recognizing its propaganda value for maintaining civilian commitment to the war effort. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's Louis Bertmeyer personally ordered script development for what would eventually become multiple motion pictures, celebrating American naval aviation heroism. Radio broadcasts carried news of the victory across the globe, with particular impact in occupied territories where populations had been subjected to constant Axis propaganda about inevitable Japanese and German victory. The British Broadcasting Corporation's European service used Midway as the centerpiece of psychological warfare campaigns targeting occupied France, Norway, and the Low Countries. According to intelligence reports preserved in the National Archives, Japanese propaganda minister Tojo Hideki ordered complete censorship of Midway battle results within Japan itself. Japanese civilian populations received no information about the carrier losses, creating a dangerous gap between official propaganda claims and military reality that would eventually undermine homefront morale. German propaganda minister Paul Joseph Goebbels faced a more complex challenge in addressing Midway's implications for Axis partnership claims. German newspapers were forced to acknowledge Japanese naval losses while attempting to minimize their strategic significance, a delicate balance that satisfied neither German nor Japanese propaganda requirements. Soviet propaganda services used Midway to reinforce claims that capitalist nations could effectively resist fascist aggression when properly motivated, providing ideological support for the Soviet Western Alliance. despite fundamental political differences. Pravda's coverage emphasized American industrial capacity and technological innovation as factors that socialist nations should emulate in their own anti-fascist struggles. The psychological impact on neutral nations proved equally significant. Swiss intelligence services reported increased confidence among American diplomatic personnel stationed in Bern, while Spanish officials noted improved morale among British embassy staff in Madrid. These subtle diplomatic shifts would influence subsequent neutral nation policies. Regarding trade and intelligence cooperation, Chinese nationalist propaganda services used Midway to encourage continued resistance against Japanese occupation, emphasizing that Japanese naval power was no longer invincible. Communist forces under Mao Zedong also incorporated Midway into their propaganda, though with emphasis on peasant guerrilla warfare rather than technological solutions. The battle's impact on war correspondents proved especially significant. Reporters, who had been filing increasingly pessimistic dispatches about Pacific War progress, suddenly had genuine victory to describe. Ernie Pyle, reporting from various war theaters, used Midway as evidence that American military competence was improving through combat experience. International newsreel footage of burning Japanese carriers circulated through Allied territories. Worldwide, providing visual proof of Axis vulnerability that no amount of written propaganda could match. The strategic implications of Midway's victory rippled through Allied planning processes worldwide, fundamentally altering resource allocation, decisions and operational timelines across multiple theaters. General George Catlett Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, convened emergency Joint Chiefs of Staff meetings to reassess Pacific theater requirements in light of the dramatically improved strategic situation. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized Midway's political implications immediately, using the victory to justify increased Pacific theater resource allocations, despite previous commitments to Europe First strategic priorities. Roosevelt's personal intervention ensured that Admiral King's requests for additional Pacific Fleet construction would receive congressional approval, setting the stage for the massive naval expansion that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The victory's timing proved especially crucial for Allied planning regarding Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa scheduled for later in 1942. General Dwight David Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces preparing for the North African campaign, benefited from the improved morale and confidence that Midway generated throughout Allied command structures. British Admiral Sir Andrew Browne Cunningham, commanding Mediterranean naval forces, received authorization for more aggressive operations against Italian naval forces, partly because Midway had demonstrated that Axis naval power could be decisively defeated through proper tactical application of available resources. The Royal Navy's subsequent victories in Mediterranean convoy battles drew direct inspiration from American tactical innovations demonstrated at Midway. Soviet Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, planning defensive operations around Stalingrad, received assurances that Japanese forces would not open a Siberian front, largely because Midway had eliminated Japan's capacity for major, new offensive operations. This allowed Stalin to concentrate additional divisions against German forces, contributing to the eventual Soviet victory at Stalingrad. According to declassified strategic planning documents from the combined Chiefs of Staff, Midway's success accelerated timelines for Pacific offensive operations by approximately 6 months. Operations against the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, originally scheduled for 1944, were moved up to 1943 based on Japanese naval weakness revealed at Midway. Australian military planners, who had been preparing for potential Japanese invasion of the Australian mainland, began shifting resources toward offensive operations in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. General Thomas Albert Blamey received authorization for expanded Australian Imperial Force operations based on confidence that Japanese naval aviation could no longer provide effective support for ground operations. The psychological impact on Allied military academies worldwide proved significant. The United States Naval Academy at Annapolis began incorporating Midway battle analysis into its curriculum within months, while the Royal Naval College at Greenwich developed new tactical doctrine based on American carrier aviation innovations. Demonstrated during the battle, Free French naval forces under Admiral Émile Henry Muselier began planning for eventual Pacific operations. Recognizing that French colonial territories in Indochina and the Pacific Islands would eventually be liberated through American naval supremacy established at Midway, intelligence services throughout the Allied world recognized that Midway had fundamentally altered Japanese strategic capabilities. The Office of Strategic Services under William Joseph Donovan began developing long-term intelligence collection priorities based on Japanese weakness rather than strength, shifting focus from defensive to offensive intelligence requirements. Victory's impact on Allied diplomatic relations proved equally significant, strengthening American negotiating positions with both Soviet and British partners who had previously questioned American military competence in the Pacific theater. 6 months after the battle, Midway's psychological reverberations continued, reshaping the global conflict in ways that extended far beyond the Pacific theater. The victory had fundamentally altered Allied strategic confidence, transforming defensive mindsets into offensive planning across every theater of operations worldwide. General MacArthur's subsequent campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands drew direct inspiration from Midway's demonstration that Japanese forces could be decisively defeated through superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and coordinated application of available resources. The Guadalcanal Campaign, which began in August 1942, proceeded with confidence levels that would have been impossible without Midway's psychological foundation. The battle's impact on American industrial production proved equally significant. Factory workers who had been producing military equipment for an apparently losing cause suddenly understood that their efforts were contributing to genuine victories. Production statistics from the War Production Board show measurable increases in aircraft and naval vessel construction. Following news of Midway's success, British operations in North Africa benefited from the global morale boost that Midway provided. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein in October 1942 occurred within a psychological context where Allied victory seemed achievable rather than merely hopeful. The desert victory built directly upon confidence levels established 4 months earlier in the Pacific. Soviet forces defending Stalingrad drew psychological strength from knowledge that Axis forces were being defeated simultaneously on multiple fronts. While Soviet propaganda emphasized domestic resistance rather than Allied cooperation, military commanders understood that Japanese naval defeat reduced the possibility of a two-front war that could have proved catastrophic for Soviet survival. According to post-war interviews preserved in the Hoover Institution archives, resistance movements throughout occupied Europe cited Midway as the moment when Allied victory became believable rather than merely desirable. French resistance networks reported increased recruitment and more aggressive operations following news of the Pacific victory. The battle's impact on neutral nations proved equally significant. Turkey's eventual decision to join the Allies in 1945 can be traced partly to strategic assessments that began with Midway's demonstration of shifting power balances. Brazilian entry into the war as an active Allied participant also reflected confidence generated by Pacific victories. Japanese strategic planning never recovered from Midway's psychological impact. Admiral Yamamoto's subsequent death in 1943 removed the one Japanese naval leader capable of innovative strategic thinking, leaving Japanese forces locked into increasingly desperate defensive operations that culminated in kamikaze attacks tactics born from desperation rather than strength. Chinese resistance forces, both nationalist and communist, expanded operations against Japanese occupation. Forces based on confidence that American naval power would eventually provide liberation rather than merely temporary assistance. The psychological impact of Midway resonated through Chinese strategic planning for the remainder of the war. The victory's influence on post-war planning began almost immediately. American diplomatic services began developing policies for Pacific reconstruction based on assumptions of total Japanese defeat that would have seemed unrealistic before Midway. The eventual occupation of Japan and establishment of democratic institutions drew foundational support from confidence established in June 1942. Perhaps most significantly, Midway established the psychological foundation for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring American forces to Japan's doorstep. Each subsequent Pacific victory from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Okinawa built upon confidence levels established during those crucial days in June, when 3 Japanese aircraft carriers burned on the Pacific horizon, marking the beginning of the end for Axis dreams of global domination. The battle's echo continues resonating through military academies worldwide, where Midway remains the classic example of how intelligence, preparation, and tactical innovation can overcome seemingly impossible odds, transforming strategic situations through decisive action at the crucial moment.